Leviticus 15. Bodily discharges. God spoke to Moses and Aaron. Speak to the people of Israel. Tell them, when a man has a discharge from his genitals, the discharge is unclean. Whether it comes from a seepage or an obstruction, he is unclean. He is unclean all the days his body has a seepage or obstruction. Every bed on which he lies is readily unclean. Everything on which he sits is unclean. If someone touches the bed or sits on anything he sits on, or touches the man with the discharge, he has to wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If a man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, the person has to wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every saddle on which the man with the discharge rides is unclean. Whoever touches anything that has been under him becomes unclean until evening. Anyone who carries such an object must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. If the one with the discharge touches someone without rinsing his hands with water, the one he touched must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. Verse 12. If a pottery container is touched by someone with a discharge, you must break it. A wooden article is to be rinsed in water. 13 through 15. When a person with a discharge is cleansed from it, he is to count off 7 days of his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe in running water. Then he is clean. On the 8th day, he is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and come before God at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest then offers one as an absolution offering and the other as a whole burnt offering, and makes atonement for him in the presence of God because of his discharge. 16 through 18. When a man and his ambition of semen, he must bathe his entire body in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every piece of his clothing and everything made of leather which gets semen on it must be washed with water. It remains unclean until evening. When a man sleeps with a woman and has an immersion of semen, both are to wash with water. They remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, the impurity of her menstrual period lasts 7 days. Anyone who touches her is unclean until evening. Everything on which she lies or sits during her period is unclean. Anyone who touches her bed or anything on which she sits must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Verse 24. If a man sleeps with her and her menstrual blood gets on him, he is unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies becomes unclean. 25 through 27. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, but not at the time of her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond the time of her monthly period, she is unclean. The same during as the time of her period. Every bed which she lies during this time of the discharge, and everything on which she sits becomes unclean, the same as her monthly period. Anyone who touches these things becomes unclean, and must wash his clothes, bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. 28 through 30. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she is to count 7 days, then she is clean. On the 8th day she is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest will offer up one for absolution offering and the other for her whole burnt offering. The priest will make atonement for her in the presence of God because of her discharge that made her unclean. You are responsible for keeping the people of Israel separate from what makes them readily unclean, lest they die, and their unclean condition defiling my dwelling, which is among them. 32:33. These are the procedures to follow for a man with a discharge or immersion of semen that makes him unclean, and for a woman in her menstrual period, any man or woman with a discharge, and also for a man who sleeps with a woman who is unclean. Thank you for listening to this chapter. God bless. Have a great Sunday.